class, which is going to be a Purim class, not focused on the Torah portion this week, which is Titzaveh, which speaks primarily about the garments of the priests, following from last week's Torah portion, which discussed the building of the tabernacle, the traveling temple, and the building of most of the furnishings. This week speaks about the garments of the priests, the high priests, and so on, amongst various other smaller details throughout, smaller in size, not in importance, throughout the Torah portion. But we're not going to focus on that this week. We will focus on a very interesting aspect of the holiday of Purim, as we do the week before the holidays. But before we get to that, I'd just like to quickly run through the story of Purim for those of us who can use a refresher course, and we can all use a refresher course all the time. So just quickly, the holiday of Purim takes place in Persia. In between the first and second temples, there was a 70-year period of destruction where there was no temple, and the Jewish people were exiled in Persia. The capital city being Shushan. Persia is modern-day Iraq, Iran, and the Jewish people were there under the kingdom, the Persian kingdom, which was ruled by a Ahasuerus. There is a name for it in English. Excuse me, I do not know how to pronounce it. So if anyone knows how to pronounce Ahasuerus and his proper English name, please share it. It's Exorexis or something. Either way, the Persian Empire, at that point, Ahasuerus had miscalculated the 70 years of Jeremiah's prophecy. And so he threw a party claiming that he had really outsmarted Jeremiah the prophet, who had prophesied that there'll be 70 years of exile, following which the Jewish people will be brought to Israel and rebuild the temple, the second temple. And so he threw a party, not just any party, but a party that lasted 180 days. Quite the party. You thought you had bad neighbors. Think about Ahasuerus' neighbors. At this party was a unique party, and to say the least, it's 10 chapters in the Megillah, so we're going to cut it short. Try to keep it to about a 5-minute overview. So I do highly suggest you look at the story inside. But at this party, he decreed that his wife Vashti be killed. She was killed. Well, it wasn't at the party that he decreed she be killed. She didn't listen to him. And so he gathered a meeting of his advisors. And one of his advisors, who we find out to be Haman, advised that she be killed to teach a lesson. And she's killed and starts the journey of a few years searching for a new bride, a new queen, and he settles on Queen Esther. Esther being Mordechai's cousin. An important note that I feel important to stress on every single year, due to the common misconception that Esther was Mordechai's niece. She was not his niece. She was his cousin, his first cousin, and he kind of took care of her because she was an orphan. And so she did not want to become the queen. She hid, but Ahasuerus' servants found her, and one thing led to the next, and she became the next queen. But Haman, twice, 2 strikes. Mordechai, her cousin, who was the Jewish leader at the time, warned her not to tell anyone that she's Jewish. And following that, Haman encouraged Ahasuerus, who later decreed that everyone has to bow down to Haman. And Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman, saying he's a Jew and he doesn't bow to anyone. And that led to Haman deciding that he has to annihilate the Jewish people. And he threw lots, and the day that he decided that he's going to annihilate the Jewish people was going to be on the 13th day of Adar. This was almost a year before what we now know as Purim. It was a Passover time when he had made these lots, and he decided that in 11 months' time, on the 13th of Adar, he will annihilate the Jewish people. He got the official signet ring on a document from Ahasuerus, the king, and it was passed to all 127 countries in the Persian kingdom at the time, that on that day, the Jews are not allowed to fight back and they are to be annihilated. What started was Mordechai gathering all the Jews and encouraging them to repent for their ways. And he gathered specifically the Jewish children. 24,000 Jewish children were gathered in the city of Shushan, where they prayed and they studied Torah. asking God for forgiveness and for salvation. Following that, Esther, Mordechai was who was an appointee of the king at the gates of the palace, was sitting with sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther, who was somewhat uninformed of what was going on outside the palace, being that she was the queen, asked Mordechai what's going on through a messenger. And Mordechai tells her what's going on and tells her that, look, the Jewish people will be saved. But the question is, are you going to have a part in it? Maybe this is the reason why God has placed you in such a position to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. Esther is saying that she doesn't know what's going to happen because she hasn't been called to the king, and for her to walk into the king unannounced can cause her to lose her head. And Mordechai says, nonetheless, now's your chance. And so she fasts for 3 days, and she asks that all the Jewish people in Shushan fast for her as well. And on the third day, she walks in, she asks for a feast, and for her and Haman, and Achashverosh are at the feast the first day, and she asks for a feast the subsequent day. The following day, they have the feast on the second day, and she points to Haman as the one who is trying to obliterate her people. And Achashverosh, until this point, did not know that she was Jewish. And so he commands that Haman be killed on the spot. Not only was he killed, but he was killed actually on the gallows that Haman had built for Mordechai. They were tall gallows, and Haman was killed. This was during Passover, the second day of Passover. And Achashverosh asks his queen, Esther, what more should I do for you? So she says, I want that on the 13th day of Adar, not only should the Jews not be killed, but can reverse the order. He says, I can't reverse an order, but I can order that the Jews can fight back. And for the next year, the Jewish people, they prayed to God, they repented. And on the 13th of Adar, the Jewish people, not only didn't they succumb to their enemies, but they weren't they defeated by their enemies, but they overpowered their enemies, and they emerged victorious on the 13th and 14th day of Adar, and which is why we celebrate. We don't celebrate the 13th of Adar, the day of the battle. We celebrate the 14th of Adar, which is the day that the Jewish people rested. The holiday of Purim, that was the day that the Jewish people emerged victorious and rested on that day, and it was instituted on that day to remember this miracle, which was later transcribed in the Megillah and was canonized, as we will discuss in tonight's class, as part of the 24 books of the Jewish canon, the Torah, the Tanakh, the book of Esther. And there are 4 special mitzvot that we do on this holiday, 4 very special mitzvot on this joyous holiday that we do. I'll pull it up on the screen here just to recap. The mitzvot on Purim that we do this year is going to be Thursday night and Friday. The first mitzvah is to hear the story, to recount the miraculous story in all its detail. The story, not just to recount it in English, but to read it in the original Hebrew from a parchment, from an authentic Megillah, read live, not by Zoom. On Zoom, we do not fulfill our obligation. The mitzvah is to hear it live Thursday night and Friday, which we will be doing here, right here in our Chabad house here at Mar Vista. Everyone's welcome to join. 6:15, we're having our Purim celebration in our backyard. Sushi and soup, everyone's welcome to join. Social distance, prepackaged food. We hope you can join. If you didn't let us know, please do. Where we will be reading the Megillah twice, 6:15 and 8:15, for those who have missed it the first time around. As well as we'll be reading it Friday during the day on our front lawn, socially distant, with some Purim goodies, 9 a.m., 12:30 p.m., and 4 p.m. 4 p.m., we're cutting it quite close to Shabbos, but it's a mitzvah to hear the Megillah twice. So even if you heard it on Thursday, you're supposed to hear it again on Friday. The second mitzvah is Mishloach Manot, to give a gift of 2 types of ready-to-eat food to a friend on Purim day. So it can be a bottle of juice and cupcake. Those are 2 types of ready-to-eat foods, to hand it to a friend on the Purim day. That's a mitzvah. So do it, give it to your Jewish neighbor, give it to a Jewish friend that you have. Make sure you do that mitzvah on Purim. We will have an opportunity to do that here at the party. The third mitzvah is matanot la'evyonim, give a monetary gift to 2 poor people on Friday. Now, if you can't find 2 poor people, you can do it on our website and write in the comments, matanot la'evyonim. We will distribute it on Purim day to 2 poor people. And the fourth mitzvah is Mishta v'simcha, eat a festive Purim meal on Friday. Now this year it gets a little tricky. Ideally, the Purim meal should be a breakfast or lunch meal because we don't want to be too full before the onset of Shabbos. And so eat a festive Purim meal on Friday. A festive meal ideally should include meat and or chicken and bread, challah, where we wash and sit down for a festive meal to celebrate the miracle. Aside from that, there are various customs. We say special prayers, additional prayer, and we dress up. The custom of dressing up is because we know that although the story of Purim seems to happen a bunch of coincidences, one following the next, we don't necessarily see the divine hand clearly, as was, say, the miracle of splitting of the Red Sea was a very clear miracle from the divine hand. Whereas Purim, it just seems to be a number of, in fast succession, a number of coincidences that seem to happen perfectly, that the universe orchestrated. But we know that it's God who had orchestrated it, and so we wear masks and costumes to stress that fact that even what seems to be masked behind nature and behind coincidences is really divine providence, amongst other customs on Purim. So that's a general overview of Purim. And please let us know if you'll be joining us on Thursday night or what time and Friday. The reason for these mitzvahs, the story number one, the story of Megillah. To hear the Megillah is very simple. We want to know the story. Number 2, 3, and 4 really all serve the same purpose. 2, giving 2 types of ready-to-eat food to someone, giving monetary gift to the poor, and eating a festive meal, all adds in the festivities and the joy and festivity of the holiday. And how can we be festive if we know that there's someone else who isn't festive? And so the best way to ensure that others are festive as well is to give them. If it's a regular person who's not poor, we give them food that they can eat to enjoy the holiday. And if it's poor people, we can give them food as well as a monetary gift to ensure that they enjoy the holiday of Purim, and that ensures that we can enjoy the holiday the best way possible. Maimonides actually explains that when it comes to these commandments, if it comes to, let's say, gifts of 2 ready-to-eat gifts to a friend on Purim, and you're going to be spending money on one of these mitzvahs, it should best be spending money on giving gifts to 2 poor people, because that's the best way to add in the joy of the holiday by giving as many poor people as possible. As a matter of fact, the Code of Jewish Law says that on the holiday of Purim, kol hapeshet yad neisenlei, anyone who stretches out their arm and says, can you please spare some change? Can you please give some charity? Even if on a regular day you would ignore them, there's someone standing at the street corner, there's someone that you're not sure if they're truthful in their endeavors or whatever it may be, on Purim we are obligated to give every single person who asks us. And that adds in the joy in the celebration, because we can only celebrate if we know everyone else is celebrating with us. With that, we'll move on to tonight's class. Tonight's class is analyzing kind of the general story of Purim. The general story of Purim, we're familiar with it. We just ran through it. And we are we just ran through it. We know the commandments, but there's something that sticks out from the story of Purim that gives us something to think about. In life, when we go through life as a Jew, here and now in the 21st century, life is very different than it was throughout our history. Throughout our history, there were governments and there were establishments. The surrounding environment was not conducive to Jewish values, and that's putting it lightly. The surrounding environments were really counter to Jewish values, discouraged us in a very light way, refined way of saying it, from performing any of our mitzvahs, and really did everything in their power to stop us from being proud Jews out in the open, which really led to Jews historically making one of 2 choices: defiance or compliance. One famous example is when the Roman legions surrounded the temple, surrounded Jerusalem during the siege of the Second Temple. And the rabbis at the time were trying to make a deal with the Roman legions to spare some cities, to spare some Jews. And there were rebels at the time, renegades, who decided that we're going to take up arms and we're going to fight them. And that didn't end well. So they were defiant, they took up arms, they burned storehouses in order to force those around them to follow their lead, and it did not end well. The Romans conquered and they lost. The Romans won, the Jewish people lost. On the other hand was European Jewry, 17th, 18th, 19th century, where they were faced with the enemies, they were faced with this idea of tremendous anti-Semitism and forcing them to do things that were against their values, and they took the other side, and that was compliance. The Jewish people decided that the best way to counter it will be assimilation. And we all know how that ended. Also not too pretty, to say the least. It was a colossal failure. A large swath of Jewish people were lost to assimilation, and sadly culminating in the Second World War and in the Holocaust, where we lost 6 million Jews. And so these two responses of defiance or compliance, what should we do? What is the correct response to navigate the world around us, which is, which was, especially in the past, very much against us? And really, what does it tell us in 2021? Are we supposed to take that compliant view? Are we supposed to take the defiant view? Or is there something in between? Or really, out of the box, is there something that really is an entire paradigm shift and we don't even live in that same box? And that's what we're going to address today through the window of the holiday of Purim. And so to begin, we're going to begin with a fundamental question, and that is, why was the story of Purim canonized? Why? Why does the book of Esther part of the 24 books of the Tanakh? For example, the story of Hanukkah isn't. And there are a number of other books which were written at the time by great sages that we still have till today, but it isn't part of the Jewish canon, the Tanakh. Why? Why was the book of Esther chosen? As a matter of fact, the book of Esther, the Megillah as we refer to it, Megillah literally means a scroll. So any scroll can be referred to as a Megillah. The book of Esther is referred to as Megillas Esther, the scroll of Esther. As a matter of fact, our sages tell us that it seems from the nuance in the verse that Mordechai actually wasn't the one pushing for the idea of it being canonized. Mordechai, the leader of the Jewish people at the time, was not the one who pushed for the book of Esther to be canonized. As a matter of fact, it's in the name itself. Esther was the one who pushed for it, and successfully, with the general assembly of the rabbis, to have the book of Esther, the story of Purim, written and canonized in the Tanakh, which is why, one of the reasons why it's called Megillas Esther. As Rabbi Yaakov in Megillat Starim, a great 18th century sage, points out, the verses imply that Mordechai only called for Purim to be commemorated with joy, but he did not call for its documentation nor its annual public reading. It was Esther who primarily pushed for this. As the Talmud relates, Esther sent to the sages, "Write my story for future generations." So Esther obviously saw a particular need for Purim to be remembered forever in Jewish tradition. Why? And what was Mordechai's reasoning for keeping quiet about it and not pushing for it? Obviously, Mordechai agreed. The fact, once the sages agreed for it to be put in, Mordechai was all for it. But initially, it wasn't his idea, to the extent that it's not called on his name. What about it pushed Esther to say it should be, and Mordechai was quiet about it? This difference in opinion will help us understand something else of the story of Purim. As Jews, we know and we believe that everything that happens in this world happens for a reason. And the story of Purim is no different. There was a reason why God caused such fear amongst the Jewish people, such a threat looming over the Jewish population at the time. And the question is what? What is it? Why did the Jews deserve such a punishment from the Almighty? Because nothing happens by chance, nothing's a coincidence. It's all with divine providence. And the Talmud asks this exact question. Why? Why did such a terrible thing as the story of Purim happen to the Jewish people? Here's the Talmud text too. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, for what reason were the Jewish people in that generation deserving of annihilation? Rabbi Shimon said to them, you tell me. They said to him, it is because they enjoyed the feast of that wicked one, Achashverosh. If you recall, I mentioned that they had a 180-day feast. There was kosher food served at that feast. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his students explained that the reason why the Jewish people deserved annihilation was because they enjoyed that feast of Achashverosh. The Talmud continues, he responded, this might be true for those in Shushan, but for those in the rest of the world who did not participate in the feast, why should they be killed? They weren't there. Shushan was the capital city. That's where the feast was. And so they said to him, then you tell us. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai answered, it is because they prostrated before the idol. What are we talking about? We're talking about as follows. A number of years earlier, the Talmud relates that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had an idol erected, and he forced the entire population to bow down to the idol. All the Jews bowed to the idol, except for three: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And when they didn't bow to the idol, they were thrown into the lion's den, and they survived. Miraculously. But all the other Jews did bow to the idol. A number of years later was this big feast. What was the purpose of this big feast? The purpose of this big feast was Ahasuerus celebrating the fact that Jeremiah the prophet, his prophecy was not coming true, and the Jews will not go back to Israel and build the second temple. As a matter of fact, the Talmud tells us that at this feast, Ahasuerus wore the priestly garments in defiance of the Almighty and of Jeremiah the prophet. Not only he wore the priestly garments, but he used the holy vessels from the holy temple. He used it at this feast. And so although at first glance, when we look at it and we say, really, is that the reason why the Jews at that time deserved annihilation? Was it because of eating at a feast? It was kosher food. What was wrong? It wasn't the kosher food that was the problem. If you'll notice, and we'll turn back to that previous text, if you'll notice, the word doesn't say it's because they ate the feast. It says because they enjoyed the feast of that wicked one. They went to this feast. And as a matter of fact, at the time of the feast, Mordechai went around and warned the Jewish people, do not go to this feast. Don't go. Don't enjoy it. Don't take part in it. You do not belong there, even if they're going to be serving kosher food and kosher wine with the best rabbinic certification. Makes no difference. A Jew doesn't belong at this feast. And they went there, and that wasn't the biggest of the problems. The problem was that they enjoyed it. They enjoyed this feast, which really symbolized this greater issue. Following what happened a number of years earlier, where they all bowed to the idol, because there are three cardinal sins that a Jew is not allowed to transgress, even if it means by penalty of death. And one of them is idol worship. And so this idea was revealing a trend and really it was reviewing this it was revealing this idea that the Jews at the time revealed themselves to be, they were comfortable seeing themselves as one of them, one of the Persians. They can enjoy this feast which celebrated the destruction of the temple. They can bow to an idol because they're just like everyone else. They are assimilating. The words of the Rebbe, of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. One of the two reasons mentioned in the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai maintains that the extreme spiritual downfall experienced by the Jews before Purim came as a result of idolatry. At the time, the growing opinion among Jews was that human survival came from achieving physical power and standing. In other words, They believed the living a materialistic and worldly lifestyle is paramount. Accordingly, they felt the need to focus on their status as a means of advancing their physical lives. The above was the foundation of Nebuchadnezzar's philosophy. And this was the Jews' sin of bowing to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Bowing means surrendering your own beliefs while allowing another's to supersede your own. Adopting such ill-grounded logic eventually led many Jews to steadily abandon their faith, carelessly desecrating their Jewish heritage and practices as they did. And so this gives us a window into the Jewish situation at the time, was that the Jewish people, they were aware of the fact that they were a vulnerable minority at the time. They knew it. And they knew that the people didn't like them. And so they chose compliance as a way out. They chose assimilation as a way out. The Jewish people, by the time Achashverosh made their party, they decided, you know what, we're going to join the party. We're going to be like everyone else. We're going to be just like the rest of the population. They were bowing not only literally to the idol, metaphorically as well. They were giving in, dropping their priorities. For someone else's beliefs. That's why, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, that's why they deserved annihilation. It wasn't just the eating at the party, it was the taking pleasure at the party. And so, what did Mordechai do about it? Here he is at the helm of the Jewish population at the time. They are close to 70 years in exile. And he's got to turn the tide, help the Jews not assimilate. And so what does he decide to do? Something which seems counterintuitive to a degree. Something which seems baffling. The Jewish people are not in a good place spiritually. Not only that, the Jewish people are not in a good place with their neighbors. They're trying to find favor in the eyes of the leading people at the time. And so what does he do? Here's a quote from the book of Esther. And all the king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and prostrate themselves before Haman, for so had the king commanded. But Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself. And when Haman saw that Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself before him, Haman became full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible to him, to Haman, to lay hands on Mordechai alone, for they had told him Mordechai's nationality. And Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordechai's people. Baffling. Why is Mordechai going out of his way to provoke Haman? Granted, at this point, our sages tell us that, bowing down is not necessarily something wrong, to bow to someone out of honor. Many people have done it in the past. Many sages have done it in the past. But the problem over here with bowing to Haman was that Haman had an idol as a necklace. And so bowing to Haman really had a deeper reason. The reason for the command was in order to cause everyone to bow to this idol. And so as a Jew, we weren't allowed to bow to the idol. And so Mordechai was not allowed to bow to the idol. But the question is, knowing that Haman is going to be in and out of the palace, because Haman was one of the king's advisors. Mordechai was also an advisor to the king, but he could have avoided the palace. Avoid confrontation. You're not in a good situation. The Jewish people are not in a good situation. They have a lot of enemies. There's a lot of anti-Semitism around. Stay away from the palace. And therefore, this way, you won't get into this problem of needing to refuse to bow to Haman. Why was Mordechai's defiance so powerful, so in your face? Where seemingly that caused Haman, not seemingly, but that's what broke loose Haman's hatred for the Jewish people and encouraged him to go to Ahasuerus and request for the annihilation of the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, the Jews at the time blamed Mordechai for that decree, which obviously was foolish, because our haters hate us because they hate us. But there was something to it in trying to figure out why Mordechai was standing in a place where he's going to have to be defiant. Just don't show up, Mordechai. Go away from the palace. In the words of the Talmud analyzes a verse in the beginning of the Megillah, in the beginning of the book of Esther. And the verse mentions that Mordechai was from the tribe of Judah, and it also mentions that he was a tribe of Benjamin. So the Talmud discusses why it mentions that he was from both tribes and others from two sides of his family. Was it literally or was it metaphorically to teach us something? And the majority of opinions is because it's telling us something positive about who Mordechai was. But here's a single opinion, the minority opinion, which says that it's actually telling us something negative about Mordechai. Scripture states in the book of Esther, there was a certain Jew, Yehudi, in the capital city of Shushan, whose name was Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So he was a Yehudi, he was from the tribe of Judah, which is actually where the name Jew comes from Judah. So he was, and this is the first time really that in scripture, the term Jew shows up. So he was from the tribe of Judah and he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Was he a Benjaminite or was he a Judite? Was he from the tribe of Judah? So Rava expounded, the congregation of Israel said, look what a Yehudian has done to me and how a Benjaminite had repaid me. What a Yehudian has done to me refers to David's culpability for not killing Mordechai's grandfather, Shimi, although Shimi was liable for the death penalty, which allowed for Mordechai's birth and his eventual incitement of Haman's jealous vendetta against the Jewish people. And how a Benjaminite has repaid me refers to Saul, King Saul's culpability for not immediately killing Haman's grandfather, the Amalekite king Agag, like we read in last week's Haftarah. So what do we see from this Talmudic quote? What we see from here is that there were Jews at the time who blamed Haman's decree on Mordechai's defiance. Mordechai sitting there in full view of everyone else, and insists on staying there when Haman is there, so not to bow down. Just walk away. Why are you staying there? To understand why Mordechai chose this form of defiance, to sit at the king's gate, to go out of his way to be defiant in the face of Haman. And as we pointed out, there were some Jews at the time who did not sit well with them. We're going to address something that when analyzing the Megillah brings out an interesting contrast between the response of Mordechai and the response of his first cousin Esther to the decree. You see, Mordechai was the spiritual leader of the Jewish people at the time. And before those feasts, yes, he tried to convince the Jewish people not to go to those feasts, but he failed. Everyone went to those feasts. So when Haman came, and Haman, who was not any regular person, he was feared, and he was recently promoted to be the viceroy, if you will. That was his term. He was, I guess, the highest advisor, chief of staff for Achashverosh. He was his closest advisor. And everyone is commanded to bow to him and to his idol. Mordechai doesn't try to avoid this confrontation. He decides to take the bull by its horns and address the problem confronting the Jewish people at the time. He sees that his people, the Jewish people, are following through with compliance, assimilation. They want to be just like everyone else. Mordechai knows that there's a powder keg ready to explode. Mordechai knows that there's anti-Semitism and there's people that are there trying to do everything in their power to delegitimize the Jewish people as a people. And he knows that any small act of defiance is going to cause that powder keg to explode. And that is precisely why he does it. He understands that the only way for him to send a clear message that assimilation is not the answer. To be like one of them is not the answer. We have to stand proud and strong of who we are because God will protect us if we do that. This is his only chance. This is the way he ought to do it, by standing strong and defiant in front of Haman and showing, I am a Jew, I do not kneel because I don't need them. I need God, and I know that it's going to be God who's going to save us. Then the decree came, the decree of annihilation. Mordechai didn't flinch. Mordechai said, all right, people, now it's time to gear up. How do we gear up? Spiritually. Let's repent. Mordechai went into the streets, donned sackcloth and ashes, led the entire community with prayer and repentance. Encouraged the Jews to be introspective on themselves, how to step up their Jewish game. Because Mordechai knew that the way to save the Jewish population from its existential threat, which at the time was not the literal threat of their physical annihilation, the spiritual annihilation that was happening way before the story of Purim, the spiritual annihilation of the Jewish spirit by assimilation. He knew that the way to counter that was by being a proud Jew and by stepping up their spiritual game. Diplomatic efforts came secondary. His conversation with Esther to encourage her to go and speak to Achashverosh, that came second. Because first and foremost, he knew this is a spiritual battle. The physical battle is going to follow. It'll fall into place once we have the spiritual battle in place. It's like someone who wants money, needs to pay a debt. Right? Johnny needs to pay a debt. So he goes ahead, he takes a check, he makes sure it's the right number of the check because he wants to find favor in his debtor's eyes. So he finds a nice rounded number check. He fills it out beautifully in calligraphy, and he hands the check with pomp and excitement to his debtor. It's just one small problem. There's no money in the account. So what good is it to send a check if there's no money in the account? That's how Mordechai viewed the situation. What good is it to try to employ diplomatic relationships to get the situation running and in positive light if the bank is empty, if there's no spiritual good on behalf of the Jewish people? God was the protector of the Jewish people. And when God saw that the Jews are turning their back on him, he turned his back on them. He said, all right, I'll step back. You want to run it your show? Run it your way. And that was an awakening for the Jewish people. So Mordechai knew that this step of defiance is what's going to help them. Esther did her part as well. She did the diplomatic part, but she also decided to fill her own spiritual coffers, if you will. As one of the early commentators on the book of Esther, the 16th century sage Rabbi Shlomo Alkabatz writes as follows: Esther's actions rectified this sin of enjoying the feast. Esther smuggled kosher food into the palace. Esther made a firm commitment to herself that she would not touch the food provided by the king. Her behavior would have undoubtedly brought great shame to the king. Indeed, Haman seized on this when he made his pitch for the Jews to be killed, arguing that they were a fifth column. The truth is that this decision put Esther in grave danger and risked her life. Let's pay attention. Esther did not display the same self-sacrifice to avoid being married to the king as she did with her insistence on eating kosher food. Due to the risk of her life, both would have been permissible, according to Jewish law. Yet she chose to specifically risk her life to eat like a Jew so as to atone for the Jews' failure in this regard. She could have mollified herself that she had no choice, but she didn't. Esther displayed her priorities, all right. She showed what she felt was of paramount importance. And she went ahead and she asked Mordechai to have all the Jews pray on her behalf and to fast on her behalf. And she said she's going to fast as well. And she goes ahead and does the diplomatic thing. but she made sure that her bank account was full. And so together, Mordechai and Esther taught us that we can't just sit back, taught the Jewish people at the time, and teaches us that we can't sit back and rely on a miracle. We have to act. And we have to act by filling our spiritual coffers, by doing mitzvahs, by doing everything in our power to step up the spiritual game. As a matter of fact, at the time, it empowered the Jews of the time to connect to God and to reconnect to God in a deeper way than was ever done, even deeper than the time of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. As our sages say in the Talmud, the verse states, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mountain when the Jews were receiving the Torah, almost 1,000 years prior to the story, more than 1,000 years prior to the story. Rabbi Avdimi Bar Chama ben Chazda said, the Jewish people are standing at the foot of the mountain in the Sinai, just a few weeks after they left Egypt. And what happens? This teaches us that the Holy One, blessed be He, overturned the mountain above the Jews like a bowl and said to them, if you accept the Torah, excellent, and if not, over there will be your burial spot. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, from here there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. Right? We were coerced. We were forced to accept the Torah. At Mount Sinai, we didn't accept it with open hands, with open arms, with open hearts. God took a mountain, hung it over our heads and said, accept the Torah or else. But that's not where the story ended. Even so, continues the Talmud, they again accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh. As the verse states, the Jews ordained and took upon them. The Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Mount Sinai. How did the Jews do that? When they willfully put their life on the line and didn't convert to a different religion. They stayed Jewish. They followed Mordechai, following his steps of defiance, and stayed steadfast to their Jewish values. They now accepted it willingly. They said, we want to be a Jew. We want to fulfill the Torah. And so Mordechai and Esther both understood that what's at stake here is not just, it's important, but not just the physical existence of the Jewish people, but more importantly, the spiritual, the essence of who we are as Jews. But they took slightly different messages. Mordechai was only focused on the spiritual side of things. That's what he was focused on. That's what was most important to him. Esther, on the other hand, took a different perspective. She focused on the physical salvation. She focused on the physical aspect of annihilation. Mordechai was the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. Esther was a Jewish girl who was in a forced marriage with the Persian king. She was balancing this careful act of being a God-fearing Jew and walking on eggshells constantly in the palace of the Persian king. And so that when she saw the salvation, when the Jews were eventually miraculously spared, Mordechai saw it as a spiritual salvation, whereas Esther saw it as the physical salvation from life and death. So to Mordechai, the salvation of the Jewish people wasn't so much about the physical salvation. That was almost like a byproduct of the primary focus of the miracle, which was the spiritual salvation of the Jewish people. The fact that spiritually the Jews will go on to fulfill the mitzvahs, be committed to the Jewish way of life. And so how did he see fit the idea of celebrating Purim? He wanted Purim to be celebrated like we celebrate Yom Kippur, like we celebrate Passover. We don't go through the whole story. We don't read the entire story. There's no mitzvah to read the entire story, but there's a mitzvah to do other things. We don't go to work. It's a spiritual day. It's a day where we pray more, where we study more. Esther said, no, this is a day where we celebrate physical celebration. I want this story canonized. I want the story to be read, the physical salvation, the story of the physical salvation of the Jewish people. I want that with all its details to be canonized and read every single year. In the words of the Rebbe. Arguably, just as Mordechai and Esther took differing approaches in their efforts to combat the decree, they also would have emphasized different aspects of the eventual miracle. Mordechai emphasized the unprecedented spiritual victory the Jews had won, namely that their return was so complete, as the Talmud says, they ordained what they had already taken upon themselves. That the act of accepting it willingly in the time of Achashverosh managed to remove the substantial caveat from back at Matan Torah. It was for this reason that Mordechai wanted to make the holiday of Purim a day prohibited of labor, not unlike Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the day when historically the Jews received the second tablets, also at Mount Sinai, of course. He intended to provide Jews for all future generations a day to properly dedicate their time to Purim's soul-centered nature. Esther, however, prioritized the miracle aspect as it was expressed in the actual salvation from Haman's decree to destroy, kill, and cause to perish all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women. In other words, Esther stressed the rescue of the Jewish body. As Mordechai Yaffe writes, a great sage, 17th century sage writes, contrasting the overtly spiritual Hanukkah miracle of the oil. On Purim, the decree was to destroy and kill the Jewish bodies and not their souls. That's why the eventual rescue from a material threat was commemorated with joy, expressed specifically through feasting, as opposed to Hanukkah, where the 8-day miracle spiritual nature does not require a daily meal. And so what do we have from here? We have from here seemingly two different opinions, two different views on how to combat adversity.
Say you have a question?
No.
We have the opinion of Mordechai, which the opinion of Mordechai is be defiant, be in their face, be there, be against them, be proud, strong in front of in the face of everything. And then we have Esther, work quietly, work under the wraps, try to counter that through working behind the scenes. And then we have the Jewish view of that time, which was, let's assimilate, that's the best way, which obviously was the wrong way. So now the question is, between Mordechai and Esther, how do we see life? What should we, when we encounter adversity, how should we counter it? And the reality is, as the Rebbe spoke many, many times, various sages throughout the ages actually took diverging viewpoints. Some said we have to go diplomatically, never to be too defiant in the faces of the nations. And others were very defiant. One who was clearly defiant, and we mentioned it in our other class, the previous Rebbe, when he was threatened with a revolver, he said, that toy doesn't make me do anything against my principles, because I have two worlds and one God. And so that toy, which they tried to threaten him with, to say things against his will and to do things against his Jewish principles, he said, it's not going to get me to talk. He was defiant in the literal sense of the word. There were other sages who said, no, you're never allowed to be defiant. And they actually quote the Talmudic passage. It's a minority view that was countered by most other sages and even contemporary rabbis. But they quote that other view from the Talmud. And they say, look, there were people who did not agree with the way Mordechai viewed life. Well, what are we supposed to do? What we're supposed to do is actually view the world in a different way. We are not living in times like Mordechai and Esther. The world around us has changed. Yet we're not saying there's perfection. We're not saying there isn't hate. I'm not saying that there isn't negativity around us. What I am saying is that especially as Jews, oppression has gone down tremendously. Not only has gone down tremendously, we are living in unprecedented times. In times when not only is our living Jewishly encouraged by the government or by the people that are surround us, the atmosphere around us, but it's actually respected. One perfect example that I get from people is we put up our menorah in front of our house for Hanukkah. For those of you who walked or drove by our house after Hanukkah may have noticed that our menorah is still out there. We got such tremendous feedback. I get people all the time walking by, still now, and they smile, Jews, non-Jews, kids, adults. They walk by, they smile, they wave, they take pictures of it. They comment how beautiful it is. The Jews come forward to tell me that they're Jewish too. And then I got people who ask me, but Rabbi, don't you think it's going to cause anti-Semitism? I'm a little embarrassed about putting my Judaism out there. We're reading anti-Semitism is reaching unprecedented times. It isn't. It is, unfortunately, growing more than the past few years. But not to get into the politics side of it, we are living in unprecedented times. Just 30 years ago in the Soviet Union, they were not able to say that they're Jewish 30, 40 years ago. In many other countries, here in the United States, 100 years ago, Jews weren't allowed to be in many places. Judaism was shunned. Nowadays, it's infinitely better. One interesting study that was done recently, it was done not too recently. In 2013, they wanted to express this idea of kind of to understand how ignorance of major global development trends are perceived by the public through kind of ancestral views. And so they did this ignorance study. And they asked people how did they think that in the last 20 years, what was here's the words of the study. In the last 20 years, the proportion of the world population living in extreme poverty was, and the people had to answer. And so 66% answered that it was doubled. The people living in extreme poverty was doubled. 29% said it stayed level, and 5% said that it was halved. Halved. It was half. It was 50% less than what it was in the past 20 years. And that's the correct answer. Only 5% of people thought the reality, which was that world poverty, people living in extreme poverty, was halved. But we're conditioned to think that the world around us is terrible and it's getting worse. Anti-Semitism and being proud as a Jew is the same idea. In the times of Mordechai and Esther, in the times of our ancestors, and it's ingrained within us to think that we should be afraid, that we should look at reality, we should look at society and say, I have to be careful, I don't have to be careful. Those times are gone. Now is the best time when we have to be out and about, we have to be proud of who we are. We have to go ahead and be firm and proud Jews. This is who we are. And we're proud of it. We're done with those times of hiding who we are. We're done with those times of saying that now we have to should I do it? Should I not do it? Those times are long gone. Now it's time to go ahead. And in the words of the Rebbe, and I'll share it on the screen. Here it is. But not sure why it does that. Today, the Rebbe said in 1992, today you only need to open your eyes and plainly see how the entire world demands that every Jew start standing up and live in a state of complete and true redemption. We have to live knowing, open our eyes. The world has changed. We don't have to see the world the way our ancestors saw it. We don't have to see it as, should we live in compliance? Should we live in defiance? It's neither defiance nor compliance. It's being proud of who we are, and the world not only respects us for it, but helps us do it. And the Rebbe continues, notwithstanding the Jews' sin of enjoying the feast, the Megillah teaches that at their core, the Jewish nation is one that neither kneels nor prostrates. This quality of holding true to their beliefs is what enabled the Jewish people to survive 2,000 years of exile and hold fast to their heritage that is so different from any other people. When a Jew accesses their inner neither kneel nor prostrate oneself, The world takes notice. Standing firmly and assertively for what we believe in will engender the world's honor and respect. And so if there's one lesson that we take from the story of Purim, it's this lesson. It's time to unmask. The world that we live in, let's change our view. It isn't the same world that our ancestors lived in. It isn't the same world that our ancestors had to fight and be defiant. Now we're living in a world where we walk around and we're proud Jews. We wear a yarmulke on our head. We wear a full beard. We light Shabbos candles openly. We light big menorahs. We celebrate Purim dressing up on Purim because this is what we do as Jews. When we are proud of who we are, we don't have to be defiant or compliant. We are Jews inherently, essentially, and we're practicing Jews. And when we do that, the world respects us because times have changed. And so we need to open our eyes. We need to have that inner shift of not looking at the world through our ancestors who had to be either compliant or defiant, and look at the world through our lives, through our times, because we're living in unprecedented times, in times that by us acting as proud Jews is the way to go. So wishing you all a happy Purim.